start looking at how that high-speed rail will work. Will it take off to Tulsa down here south of town, or can we get it to come up through the center part of town? And we'll be looking at that and how the hub will have to deal with that. And a lot of you know about the streetcar, the downtown streetcar funded by MAPS and being studied by our firm in the downtown circulator. This Robinson-Broadway couplet and the Robinson-Hudson couplet is kind of the route that is, as Rick Kane said to me one day, is percolating to the top. It's not finalized and no one has said that's the route that we're going to use, that's the base that we're going to build on, but it is kind of emerging from all the alternatives as, hey, this might be the way we need to head into the future. Now there are some other options. The southern leg of that has a real impact on some of the hub studies that we'll talk about, and there's other northern and central legs that we'll talk about in the future, but clearly it has an impact on the hub. And then finally, all that trains and rail and transit is important, but we also need to remember automobiles and pedestrians. People will need to get here by car, taxis, and people will want to walk to this, and we want them to walk to this. So we're going to look hard at how we walk through and over and around that rail line that bisects our community, and how we can use this hub and this study to maybe think about penetrating that and opening that up and making it less of a distraction and a divider between our community. So Allan is going to walk us through the evaluation components and matrix, and then plow through the sites, and then we'll open it up to you all.
When we start looking at trying to determine the best site for a facility, we try to start with setting some criteria, putting some criteria in place that gives us a way to evaluate what are some very subjective things or qualitative measures and make it a little bit more quantitative. So it's really a tool, although it's not scientific, that helps us do that. And for this project, we've identified at this level anyway what we're calling the Tier 1 analysis, where we're trying to go from a large group of sites down to a smaller group that we want to get your input on. We're looking at 4 basic areas. The first one in red is transportation accommodation. That's basically, can we accommodate the transit program? Can we get all the transit modes into this location? So that's the first one. And can we balance that in terms of being able to provide the connectivity between all of them? The other one is, does the site allow us to create a civic presence? Is it visible? Is it going to be in a location that is going to be not only highly visible, but give you the opportunity to create a civic entrance and a gateway to the building, to the city and the region itself? We also look for sites that can accommodate economic development in terms of having some development potential, either in terms of having vacant property available or underutilized parcels, surface parking lots that can be changed to either buildings, parking, and so forth. And it's also in a desirable, walkable location that works with all the other uses in the area. And it also relates to access. We have to be able to get automobiles there. There will be some level of parking requirement, although we usually try to not focus too much on parking because it is a transit facility. We don't want everybody driving here. We want people to use transit. So more importantly is the pedestrian access, making sure that it's well connected, as we talked earlier, from having a street grid that is very conducive to pedestrian activity that you're already doing with the Project 180 plan, but making sure that it integrates well with that plan. So if we keep those 4 things in mind, we then use each of those, what we called framework components, and we evaluate each one. Keeping it at a pretty high level, we look at whether it's a core accommodation in terms of, does it meet the minimum? There are also fatal flaws, and some of those fatal flaws have already been flushed out, but in terms of looking at the sites we'll be talking about in a minute, does it meet the minimum requirements in terms of providing accommodation without having to have big infrastructure changes to make it work? The next one is, does it meet the general requirements? Will it allow for future accommodation of all those framework components? And then we go to excellent. That means everything is basically there to let it happen now. We don't have to make any major structural changes to accommodate that site. So each of these is accommodated in a ranking, which you'll see here in a minute as we get into the site locations. So these are showing the initial 10 sites, and these were basically put together by working with the the steering committee or the advisory committee and basically just sticking some dots on the map saying, let's look at this one, let's look at this one might work. Some were ruled out pretty quickly because they were too far away or they weren't along the rail corridor. So you'll see that all the sites essentially follow the rail corridor in some capacity or another. And we'll go through each one of these individually. Be thinking about your ideas on this. You know, maybe we missed some, maybe there's some that just ought to come off that we're considering. But what we're trying to do is to rank these and bring it down to 2 or 3 sites that we can take to what we call Tier 2. And once we get to Tier 2, we will go to a higher level of detail where we'll actually start to lay these sites out to make sure that everything fits, that we can get auto access, that parking fits, that we've got space to accommodate the rail platforms, space to accommodate ticketing, back of house areas, maintenance, and so forth. That all those things really work, and then we'll test those sites. We can't go through the process of doing that on all 10, and there's no reason to because some of them will drop out during this process. So what we're looking for is your input into that process, and we've gone through it with the steering committee. We've got some preliminary recommendations. We want to make sure that you're agreeing with those recommendations. So we'll go through these one at a time. The first one is we're calling the North Bricktown parking lot. This is Main Street. This is, north is up, this is the railroad corridor. And the parking lot we're talking about, this is ACOG's office. Their parking is behind it. And this is a leased parking lot. There's a rail spur that comes off here that heads out towards the Adventure District. So we're looking at essentially this area, this parking lot. Now, whether or not this site will accommodate everything, we're not quite sure of yet, but we think all the sites that we're looking at essentially are close to being large enough to test out as we move ahead. And then along the bottom is our evaluation under each of those framework components. Transit accommodation, civic presence, economic development, auto pedestrian. And if we go back to again, think of the color codes, poor being red, good being yellow, excellent being blue. So you can kind of get a sense graphically of how these fall out. If you start to see a lot of red, you know this site is not a good site. The more blue, the better. So for transit accommodation, we ranked it fairly low, and I won't go through all these in detail, but the reason it's ranked low is it is fairly far north of the existing facility, which is the Santa Fe Depot, where the existing Amtrak platform is. Another element is that if high-speed rail or commuter rail were to connect to the Adventure District, that line would basically cut through this parking lot and join this right-of-way. So it starts to get bifurcated, if you will, by that corridor in the future, meaning the platform could not be along a curve, it would have to be further down this direction. So we felt like there were some challenges here on the transit accommodation. Civic presence, ranked neutral. The problem we have with this one is really visibility. It's pretty much buried behind some other buildings. It's across this rail line. If we jumped across the rail line and could bridge over it and get some frontage on 2nd Street, it might get better. So we talked about that. So this one more or less comes out fairly neutral in the end. The next site is immediately adjacent to that. This is where the buffalo statues are. Pretty much ranked the same way. It's got a little better civic presence maybe because it fronts now on 2nd Street or Main Street, but it has the same general issues in terms of transit accommodation of possibly being split by this line going to the Adventure District, or high-speed rail comes through here and continues to Tulsa through this site. Santa Fe Station. So here we're seeing Gaylord, the existing Santa Fe Station, the Amtrak platform, that's its canopy. On the other side, this is the elevated rail guideway with the 2 primary east-west streets going under it, Bricktown over here. As you can see, this site ranked high, and I think it's the only one that actually ranked high on the transit accommodation standpoint, because here we have a wider right-of-way, elevated guideway, if you will, that accommodates the Amtrak platform, could accommodate commuter rail, still allow some freight bypass. We probably don't have to rebuild the entire area if we locate a station here. Now the question would be, is the Santa Fe Depot itself big enough to accommodate all the other needs? But it has great civic presence. Economic development opportunity ranked medium, primarily because the Cox Center is right across the street. It essentially turns its back on this location. However, we are closely watching what's going to happen with the Cox Center in terms of maybe potential redevelopment. And as you get a new convention center, what happens with this site? That's something we want input on and are looking to continue to work with the city as that process moves forward as well. It also has very good connectivity to Bricktown. The old tunnel that connected to the passenger platforms actually could penetrate through the wall on this side and connect this facility into Bricktown. So this will rank fairly high. It comes out as a blue in the end.